A very warm welcome to this webinar, where we'll be specifically focusing on transitioning to V4 of the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, PCI DSS, which is the global standard for protecting payment card information. By way of introduction, my name is Martin Jones. I'm one of the directors at URM, which is a PCI QSA company, and I'm joined by Alistair Stewart, one of URM's senior QSAs who will be presenting this webinar. If I could start just by running through the agenda for today's webinar. With the introduction of the V4 coming into effect from 31st of March of this year, the overall goal of this webinar is really to provide you with some advice and guidance on preparing for a successful transition from version 3.2.1. And these are the specific topics that we'll be focusing on today. So firstly, Alistair will just be covering off the confirmation of the timetable on the mandatory requirements. When do those V4 requirements actually become compulsory? We'll then be looking at one of the big changes was around multi-factor authentication, MFA. So what are those, in terms of those new requirements? Then we'll be focusing on e-commerce payment page scripts. So what's new for the e-commerce payment pages, and how complicated, challenging will those be to implement? Linked to this, we're then looking at e-commerce payment providers. Naturally, a number of organizations will be using third parties for e-commerce payment. And one question we'll be asking is, what can you do to ensure your providers are compliant? Scoping, we'll be looking to see what the changes are with regard to V4. And so Alistair will be advising what you need to do in order to gain an accurate scope for the new version. Remote assessments, we'll be looking at how much of your assessment can be done remotely. Can they all be done remotely? And do remote assessments involve more work? So those are some of the questions we'll be addressing at that particular point. One of the significant changes that was made with V4 was the introduction of the customized validation approach. Alistair will be explaining what they are and why would you use them. And then we'll be looking at sort of lessons learned from the early transition. Alistair and the team, the QSA team, have already been involved in a number of assessments, and we'll be sharing our experiences on pitfalls to avoid and how best to prepare for your transition. One thing just to say at this point is that the webinars are equally applicable to those organizations undertaking a self-assessment questionnaire, particularly a SAQ A, as well as obviously the QSA-led ROC assessments. Before I start, here's a quick introduction to URM for those of you not familiar with the organization. We were actually founded nearly 2 decades ago in 2005. We specialize in providing tailored consultancy and training in the areas of information and cybersecurity, data protection, business continuity, and risk management. Over the last 19 years, we've grown steadily and organically, and we've now got a team of over 35 GRC and technical cyber consultants. Of this number, 7 specialize in the area of PCI DSS compliance and are all PCI qualified security assessors, QSAs, and URM is a QSA company, as I mentioned. The team has worked with hundreds of organizations from all sectors and all sizes, and we'll be sharing some of those experiences generally, as well as our particular experiences with V4. I think one thing I'd like to say is one of the things we pride ourselves on is our pragmatic approach to both compliance and assessments, and working with organizations to find the most appropriate and sensible way for them to meet the requirements of PCI DSS. And not only that, I'd say our consultants are also renowned for not just their technical knowledge, but their ability to apply and share that knowledge, and also their passion for their area of expertise, and none more so than Alistair Stewart. Alistair's been a QSA now for over 10 years, and he's been involved in over 100 assessments of the standard, and was without doubt one of the most experienced and respected QSAs in the UK. One thing just to mention before we start, as with all URM webinars, you'll have the opportunity to ask any specific questions you may have around the new requirements as we go along. So just submit your questions using the question pane, and Alistair will attempt to answer as many as he can at the end of the webinar. Alistair, just before we start drilling down into the sort of the different topics, obviously with your experience, in terms of and you've seen obviously a number of changes to the standard, How significant are the changes with V4?
So it's probably as the significant as the change when they went from 2 to 3. They only tend to jump a full number from 3 to 4 or 2 to 3 when they've made some big changes to the way the standard is structured, the way it's assessed. From 2 to 3, they made some major changes. In between 3 and 4, they did a lot of smaller revisions, adding new requirements and changing it to keep up with the changing security landscape. But they jumped to V4 because they, partly because they introduced the customized validation, which is a whole brand new way of validating the standard, and also because they had a number of big technological requirements that were introduced that we're going to talk about today as well, the e-commerce stuff. Those are in response to vulnerabilities and new attacks and new lines of attack on e-commerce sites to try and help bolster against whatever the changing threat landscape is. But they are pretty heavy from a technical perspective compared to some of the normal minor revisions. And then, of course, customized validations we're going to talk about later is a whole brand new way of approaching validating your compliance with the requirements. So that's why they jumped to 4, is because there was a lot of significant changes to the structure of the standard.